Our speaker today, Henry McCarthy, is a poet. He's former assistant dean of the College of Education at Appalachian State, and he hosts the radio program Poets and Writers on the WEHC-FM at Henry College. I cannot say that. Poets and Writers concentrates on the philosophy of poets and writers and features interviews, poems, and songs of artists from Virginia, North Carolina, and the surrounding regions. So we're very glad to have him with us. Henry?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's good. Wow. A lot of familiar faces here today, and Steve, he's just great. He said, "Are you going to do the whole program today?" Because usually we'll go in the audience and ask about your favorite poems and so on. But I am going to do the whole program today because we do the other. That's a program in itself. I came up from Winston-Salem. We're down there a lot. As you know, we've been here around Abingdon for many years, and we were over at Appalachian State, and we're based out of Winston-Salem more now. And I know some of you have been under the weather, and Patty, many of you know her, just had her knee surgery, knee replaced. So I've been keeping that ice machine, going, running back and forth and so on. But I did, it's certainly wanted to be here today. This is one of my favorite places. You have these places that are special to you, spiritual, if you want to say, but I can think of the Oregon coast, Bass Lake, the Creeper Trail, certain areas of that. And this is a place that I love to come. And I sneak in and out, and I always enjoy hearing the presentations, and I see Bob Hill over here. He's always so polished, so please don't expect that from me today, but I'll try to stay on that. But I love what you do. And so I wanted to talk. I haven't had a chance to do this. I've been doing radio for about 11 years now, and I started after I transitioned from Appalachian State, and I was doing a good bit of stand-up poetry around here, and I think it was Teresa Keller, and Teresa came to me and said, "Well, Reese Shear said we could get you to host a radio show about poets and writers because you could talk about anything," which meant I could talk endlessly about anything. So I started doing that, and it started as a lark. Our idea was to get the little people involved. It was not, my intention was to get by that poems from the heart and not the academic aspect. I spent 31 years in academia or in higher ed, and then a number of years in teaching in public schools. And so the idea was that you would get folks sharing their poems, and that's what we were able to do. And it just kept growing, And one day, about the first 6 months I was doing it, and Sean O'Sullivan had been on, and some of you remember Doc Miller. Do you remember Doc Miller? It's a great poet. And I said to the young lady, I said, "Wow, I wish I could have gotten him on because he passed away." And she said, "Well, you could have." And I said, "Well, I know I'd have to take a big tape recorder down." And, my mind was there. And she said, "Oh, no." She said, you just need to get you a little digital pocket recorder." And I said, "Oh, well, I didn't know anything about that." I said, "Well, where did you get one of those?" And she said, "Across the street at the bookstore." So this opened up a whole world to me. And I was able to begin to, because a lot of times people can't come to the station. So I was able to begin to go on the road, and I got, frankly, pretty good with it. And so when I do, I've been in Chapel Hill a lot lately, and we're actually archived. All the shows and programs, some of my papers are archived there for whatever it's worth. So I was just interviewing, I love libraries, and I love life. And so I thought that I would, I met this lady. Actually, the way I got into Chapel Hill was through this radio show. I was walking down 9th Street over at Durham, and I heard a fella in Regulator Books talking about some really good writers, Eudore Welty and Faulkner and so on. I thought that fella's pretty good, so I think I'll just try to get him on the show. So I bought his book, and it's William Ferris. So William Ferris, you may not have heard of him, but last year William Ferris won 2 Grammys. And William Ferris was Rolling Stone Professor of the Year back in the 90s. And he's originally from Mississippi, and he was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Endowment and so on. One of the most unassuming people you will ever meet. So I went over to interview him in his office, and he said, well, what are you going to do at these shows? And I said, well, I don't know. I have CDs and, shoebox. I don't really know what I'm going to do. He said, well, we would like to have them. And so that's the way I wound up at Chapel Hill. And as a result of that, I started interviewing some folks there. And just this past week, I was in Chapel Hill interviewing Elaine Westbrooks, who is the vice provost over the university system of Chapel Hill's libraries. And that includes law libraries, Southern Folk Life, Southern Historical, all those. And I was able to get her because I was using this. So a lot of times they think you're going to come in, with the sound truck and this kind of thing, and here you come in and you just do this. So, but and also I was out in, one of my favorites was out in Hannibal, Missouri. And I woke up one morning and I said, let's go to Hannibal, Missouri. And Paige said, well, what's out there? And I said, well, that's Mark Twain. She said, well, it probably won't be much, but we'll go. And she's game for about anything. We've been married so many years, she's used to me. So we went there, and there's a fellow by the name of Henry Sweets. And Henry Sweets was on my show. I'd interviewed him by telephone. But Henry just retired. He was over the museum, if you will, at the Mark Twain Museum. And if you haven't been to Hannibal and get on the riverboat and so on, you just feel you just feel his presence there. Fact is, we wound up in the old house where he made his last speech. So, but I'm going to just, let me just play you just how this thing works. Because, again, this is a joy for me to do. And Hannibal, Missouri. And I'm interviewing the director of the Mark Twain Museum, Henry Sweet. You've heard him before. We've had him on once before. It's such a great interview. We've been walking around the town here, Mark Twain's old stomping ground. So, Henry Sweet, how are you today? All right. First question we have is, of course, I know a little bit about you, but I know you grew up in Hannibal, correct? That's Hannibal. Okay, Hannibal. It's going to be the church grade. Yeah. About 10 years a day, probably teaching, and came back here in January 1978 to run Mark Twain Museum. So I've been here at the museum for 7 years. Well, Benny and I drove up with him for a couple of days, came up to Carolina, went to Springfield, Illinois. But let's do one part. Just show you how this thing works. Welcome to Poets Riders, WEHC 9.7, coming to you from the beautiful area of Henry College campus. And we have a great day for you today. I off-road. I'm at Davis Library at the University of North Carolina. I love libraries, and I know many of my listeners do too. We have Elaine Westbrooks on today, and she is the chief of all these libraries. So we're going to talk with her about her life and about libraries today. And stay tuned, because we've got some great stories about libraries. My buddy over there is spokesman at Damascus, Virginia. Go love this one. So Elaine Westbrooks, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
Well, as we like to ask you about here, right about where you're from, Elaine.
Well, I'm originally from a little town called Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is about 3 miles south of Pittsburgh. And that's where my parents grew up. They migrated there. I was working at the steel mills. And all my uncles worked at the steel mills. All my aunts did some kind of work associated with steel mills. So I feel like steel mills is just kind of part of my blood. And I think that the best part of living in a mill town is there was always a great library. And again, it's Carnegie. That's how you pronounce Carnegie in Pittsburgh. It's not Carnegie, it's Carnegie.
Well, we'll stop with that because I pronounce it Carnegie, So, but I share that with you and again, this is just a joy for me because a number of you have listened to the show, some of you have been on the show, and I want to say that sometimes you start things in life. I went the academic route. I didn't want to really actually. My mother had third grade education. My dad was from the streets of Boston, and she was from Roan Mountain over here, and they met at a train station in Johnson City, Tennessee. But I learned early on that I liked to stand up and talk, so I got into the academic world. But the most meaningful thing, and one of the most meaningful things in my life, has been this show and the ability to catalog ideas and people and personalities, because one of the things I look for and want to do on the show is bring the person out. We can get books. I started this show, I had to beg people to be on. I get calls from New York, reps and so on, wanting people to be on, and it's a lark to me because they had no idea. I'm running this out of my pocket. But the thing about it is, the idea was, as I've said, to get folks involved and to get them on. So one of the first things that around the mountain here, and if you're from the South, and no offense if my dad was from the North, but if we say where you're from, now what do we mean? Is that literal? Do we mean Franklin, Massachusetts, and you stop there? We want to know where you're from. We want to know a little bit of gossip. And then if you want to tell a few stories and get real human about it, no Uncle Joe who used to get drunk and come to the Thanksgiving. And so we like to hear that sort of thing, the human part. So, and it's been amazing because asking that question, where you're from, I've had some writers really divulge, and they've been human. And I've had several of them say, well, I really like to be on your show because you talk to people. And some people say, well, Diane Rehm does it this way, and I have to remind Patty that I'm not Diane Rehm. I'm Henry McCarthy. And the only thing you have to watch about me if you're on the show is I start talking. Lee Smith, for example, I want to mention several people who've been on the show. I've got a number of stories about people who've been on the show. We've actually done 207 shows now. But Lee Smith, I said, Lee's from Grundy. And if you know any of her books and so on, and Lee is a talker. And I went to her house there in Hillsburg, and she met me at the door, and she said, come on, Henry, you've got to help me. And she ran out the door, and she said, and this dog is running ahead of us, and she said, we've got to catch Betty. And I'm like, you do a radio show, and we're running down an alley, and I'm thinking, if we don't catch this damn dog, I don't get an interview, right? So we finally caught Betty and brought her back, and then she said, don't tell Hal. And Hal is a real interesting person because Hal Carruthers is, quite a writer in himself, was an editor at Newsweek, and she said, don't tell him because Betty has a hurt leg, and I was supposed to be taking care of her. So we got the interview going, and I said, now, Lee, I tend to talk a little bit too much, so feel free to interrupt me. And Lee said, don't worry, honey, I will. And if you Google Henry McCarthy Poets and Writers, these will all come up. And the one under Lee Smith, it comes up. And she would just be talking. We're not really listening to each other. We're just talking aside. It's truly one of my favorite interviews, but I did want to emphasize that because technology is something like some of you I came late to. And when I first started this show 10 or 11 years ago, they said, I said, how far does this reach? And they said, well, about 40 miles. It goes up to Marion. It goes, close to Johnson City. And I said, well, that's real good. And they said, but we stream. And so help me, this is true. The only thing that went through my mind was a stream. A mountain. I'm thinking, but you stream. I mean, how does that work? What do you mean by that? Well, it turns out that they do. And then, you can pick it up live anywhere you want to. And as I say, this is on the internet, it's on Google, so I can just, when I get dementia, I can just pull this up and it says, hello, I'm Henry McCarthy, and it tells me who I am. So, okay, a number of people that I pulled just a few stories out of here, and I went through the 207, and I'm actually at this point taking time to reflect, which I'm not prone to do. And there are many characters I've had on. I interviewed you in my, out in the laundry room. Yeah. Okay. But this Edwin Wilson is Mr. Wake Forest. Edwin Wilson if you go to, I was there yesterday. I love to go to libraries. I was in Wake Forest Library. You go in, and there's this portrait of Edwin Wilson. And over to the right is a statue of Edwin Wilson. Well, guess what, folks? He ain't dead, right? You think, I'm thinking. And so someone mentioned to me, they said, you should interview Mr. Wake Forest. He brought Maya Angelou there and many others, and they said, he's just a great guy. They said, now his wife is a little different. I have to be careful with you, and I don't mean this disparagingly. They're two different personalities. And she's known, Emily's known to be quite a character and very direct and very, very good writer, and they've been married for years. And they'll say, but, you need to meet Edwin, but his wife is a little tough. So anyway, I was there one day, and I actually interviewed Edwin, had him on the show, but my grandkids were in the library with me. And I said, I'm going to take you, unless you see his portrait, this is Edwin Wilson, and there's a statue of Edwin Wilson, and my grandkids said, yeah. And I said, I'm going to take you upstairs and meet him. And they said, he's not upstairs, he's dead, Granddad. I said, he's got these portraits and all. And I said, no, he's very much alive. And Edwin now is 96. And that was a couple of years ago. But to me, and I love humor, to me, if you can't laugh, and I get so many laughs out of this kind of thing. So we go up there and remember who his wife is. And she's quite a character. Now, part of it was he was a young professor just out of the Navy, real good looking. So some of the folks, I think some of the older women probably still resent Emily marrying him because that's kind of the word. So we go up there, and the secretary says, I said, I'd like to go see Mr. Wilson. And she says, Dr. Wilson said, someone here to see you. Do you want company? And he said, I've got my grandkids there. And he's just seeing it from the door. He can't see out. And he says, no, I'd rather not. I'd rather not have any company today. And she said, go on in. And we go in, and he looks up, and he says, oh, I thought you were my wife. True story. Doesn't get him. All right, little story. And then Sean O'Sullivan, God bless Sean. Sean, he's so much, I enjoyed working so much with Sean over the years. I had him on a number of times. Said one of the funniest people he ever met was Andy Griffiths, and he talked about the different shows Sean did. And did he ever tell you a story about the big dog they were doing live, and the dog was tied to the stage in the set, and it saw a mouse or something that pulled the whole set down while they were live on television. And speaking of sets, Sean, this was not on the show, but we were in Bristol one night in a restaurant, and we were doing poetry, and the set, they had a petition between the walls, and it fell. But it was not made of brick. It was more like cardboard or something, and it fell on me. And Sean comes running over and says, oh, my God. And he said, thank God you got a hard hit. He said, it would have killed me if it had fallen on me.
He said, that's fine.
Just funny. It's Naomi Shihab Nye. Naomi is world famous, and she was one of my early interviews. She was here on campus. They really got her to come. I noticed that she refers to her, she is Palestinian by background, but if you've ever read any of Naomi Nye's work, she is really good. So we had her here, and then she was with Caroline Kennedy. This is how, networks work, and this is what I tell meet people, So I said, she emailed me about something. In fact, it's the little book that I had. She wrote a blurb for it, and she said, I'm with Caroline Kennedy, and, we're doing a book tour or something. So I said, well, how about getting Caroline to, autograph her book and send it to me? And she said, she paused, and she said, all right, I'll do it. And she did, and I got that in the mail, and that's at Chapel Hill. But she's quite a poet. I love her poetry. I had the Carter family. I had Dale Carter Jett on. He's part of the Carter family. I knew them years ago when I was doing prison reform. Not that they were in prison, but I was doing prison reform out of the jails here. That's before I became assistant principal at Abingdon High School. Anyway, I got to know Jeanette when she was starting. How many of you have been down to the Carter Fold? Yeah, well, I can tell you when that started, Jeanette, I was walking around down there and the grass was this high and she was outside of AP's old store. And she came down and she met me and she said, I noticed you just looking around. Said, I'm Jeanette Carter. Said, Daddy always wanted me to open this back up and make a little country music place, and said, I'm going to do it. And so I got to know Jeanette, and Dale is her son, and Dale is the grandson of Sarah A.P. and Maybelle. If you saw the Ken Burns, you saw that. That's accurate. I watched that because I wanted to see how they handled the Carter family on that, and Ken did a good job with that. And what happened was, we had Sarah, AP, and Maybelle. And AP and Sarah, of course, were married. And then she fell in love with Coy Bates, which it was AP's cousin. So and it was quite a scandal at that time or among family. So Coy left and went west and went to California, and he was a mechanic. And so he heard her song one night. She dedicated it to him or sang it. And that's that old radio station out of Texas that was huge, and he heard it in California, and he came and guided her. So anyway, Jeanette invited me down to the house to help her just kind of brainstorm the Carter Fold, and she would cook. Jeanette was the cook there at the cafeteria, the school cafeteria, and so we were sitting there, and I took Rex Partington with me. And if you remember Rex, great guy, but he had quite a bit to drink, and that's just fact. But then I had him in my Volkswagen camper, if you can imagine, going up that hill to Jeanette's, and he's looking around and so forth. And Jeanette, of course, he was not drunk, but he had quite a bit to drink. And so he set the table, and we had a little kitchen table. And later on, I took our congressman down there, Rick Boucher. But anyway, Jeanette, just a real honest, unassuming woman. And so we're sitting at the table, they're eating, the great cook, little tiny table. And there's this black-haired lady, dyed black hair there, and she's quite grouchy. And I'm thinking, who is she? And then Jeanette said, Mama, this is Henry, and he's going to try to help us. And she went, now, really? Now, I say that lovingly, not the stereotype, because that's the kind of character I'm trying to do. She was the show. She had the voice, and she was really one of the key behind that whole group. But she left, she would come back summer, and she left Joe and Jeanette with AP. So that's the story there. And Dale's been on. Dale came over to Appalachian State. He had not performed. I brought Jeanette over there, and Dale was with her, young. He's never been on, never performed on stage before, and we tricked him into getting him up there. And so that's, he's been on. Jeanette and William Cohen. Jeanette and William Cohen. Any of you remember from Maine, William Cohen, Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton? Well, this is the way, being a big, honcho in the network industry of radio and TV, I go to the Black Arts Festival in Winston-Salem, which every 2 years is fantastic. I mean, truly is fantastic. And I'm one of the few white faces there. So I happen to notice that there's this other white guy over there with gray hair, with a very beautiful lady. And I thought, I remember him, because you remember William Cohen on TV, and you still see him on TV. He's talking about some of Trump's ideas from time to time on defense. So I'm thinking, I asked this other actor there, and I said, who is it? And he said, I don't know. He's just some actor. I don't know who he is. So I thought, no, I know he is somebody that I've seen on television. So anyway, meantime, his wife, Jeanette, it's an interracial marriage, and they got married, and Strom Thurmond attended the wedding. So where I'm going with this, so I want to get her on. I don't know who she is, but she's written a play about Anne Frank and Emmett Till, okay? So she's one of the special people there, and these are the acting and so on superb. So I go up to Janet, and I say, Janet, I'm Henry McCarthy, WHC 90.7, and I'd like to have you on my show. And she said, And Clancy, if you ever notice real success, they always have time for you. People who are successful. I tell my grandkids, and she looked at me, she was very charming, and she said, well, she said, I'd like to do it, said, but we've got these press conferences going on upstairs, and we've got the TV stations. But she said, I'll tell you what, you come up there, and you just wait and till they finish, and you can interview us. And she said, you may want to interview Bill, too. And I said, Bill? She said, yes, William Cohen, former Secretary of Defense. I said, oh, yes, Bill. She said, because he's a very good poet. So one of my shows I have Janet Cohen and William Cohen. She's talking about her play, and I have the former Secretary of Defense quoting his poetry. Now that's, I think, pretty special. So that gave me a little bit of bragging rights, and it was so cute to interview them because they have a great relationship. But William Cohen sent me a letter after that, an email, and said, Henry, thank you so much for interviewing us. And he said, he called it arm wrestling. He said, Janet and I were arm wrestling or so on. Here it is. What was it he said here? Again, John. Henry, thanks so much for sending the recording along. Janet and I enjoyed playing tag wrestling with you for the show. The folks in Winston-Salem were really warm and wonderful, and I'm sure those in Abingdon are just the same. If we ever get a break, we know where you live and just might show up. Thanks again for a great interview. Hope your listeners found our comments stimulating, if not enlightening. And it was enlightening. And Janet, who basically they step around Washington D.C. a lot, so she was asking me some very penetrating questions, which was interesting. And we talked about that when they got married, because she's African American, and I don't know if you remember the wedding, it was played up a lot. And she said that Strom Thurmond, who she liked as a person, he was very gracious. And that was about the time that it came. Well, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying interpersonally, folks, when we deal interpersonally with people, she certainly, Janet would tell you she was no fan of his in any other way. But that was the time that we discovered that Strom had the black daughter. You remember that? And no one knew about it and so on. And she said it's so interesting. If you listen to the show, she talks about, how he came to her wedding and he looked at her as if she were his daughter. So that is another story that I've gotten out of this. And then Charlie Lovett, he wrote The Bookman's Tale. And Charlie Lovett is an interesting fellow. His father taught at Wake Forest. He is one of the heirs, do you say, to the Coca-Cola, So I go to interview him, and I notice these Coca-Cola signs. It's a very fancy house, but he's got these Coca-Cola signs, and I didn't get the connection, but I guess Coke helped build the house. And Charlie Lovett has a house there in Winston-Salem, and it's filled with rare books, and he has Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland. He has a typewriter that William Carroll typed Alice in Wonderland on. He also has one of the 6 privately owned books, first edition. And so the house is just full of all these rare books and things. And so I'm interviewing him. Patty's with me, and she's downstairs. And I'm interviewing him, and I never like to stop because we can edit it, take it back, and we can edit. So what I do is I keep going, and I look out the window, and I see a motorcycle policeman show up. Then I see 3 or 4 squad cars, and Charlie looks out, and he's like, is your wife downstairs? Like, maybe they're after her. I don't think he meant it that way, but I said, oh, no, she's fine. And he said, well, an alarm must have gone off. And since the alarm has gone off, said, I guess maybe I should check. I said, no, let's just go ahead, Charlie, and complete the interview. So we did. We finished the interview. And the next morning in the paper, I'm reading on the front page of the Winston-Salem Journal that his next door neighbor, her house was broken into during the daytime, during the time we were there, and she hid in the closet and called the police, and the police came out and arrested the robber. So I thought that was an interesting story. I'd never had experienced anything quite like that, but I was glad to know that they arrested the fella. And they said a little lady, she was tiny, and I remember they said she wore tennis shoes. I don't know what that had to do with the article, but she was hiding in her closet. So that's what I think about Charlie. Actually, the bookman's tale. He actually now has funded, really, Bookmarks bookstore in Winston-Salem. Guys, I'm looking at Pat Conroy, Nancy. Many of you know Pat Conroy, the great Santini, and all his books. He passed away a couple of years ago, and Nancy Olson, who has, if you go to Raleigh, she has Quail Ridge Books. She passed away also several right after Pat, but anyway, she founded Quail Ridge Books, and it's one of the top 20 bookstores in the country independently owned. So Nancy, I went in there one day and I said, I'd like to interview you, and she pictures on the billboards and everything. She said, well, I'd be good. I'd be happy to be on. She looks a little like Aunt B, and I started interviewing her, and I knew she spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and so I said, where are you from? And she said, well, I'm from down in Southwest Virginia originally. I was born over in Dickinson County. Small world. And so we got to know each other as a result of that, and it really gave me an inroad. So anybody and every author in the world wants to go through there because they sell books. So she said, Pat Conroy was a good friend of mine. He's going to be here. He's got a new book out called My Reading Life. So she said, if you want to interview, I said, well, I didn't ask him and so on. She said, we're going to go out. We're going to have some wine. And said, we're going to have something to eat. When he comes back, you just get down in front of him and hold up your recorder and record him. So I did. I called actually to do it. And they came in and they were both feeling very good because they had quite a bit of wine. And Pat is one of the funniest people. He writes dark. But Pat was one of the funniest people. He could take, the great Santini, his father who abused him. He could stand up and say, look, I had the worst father in the world. Now let's just get that behind us, but I will live with it the rest of my life. And then he would start telling story after story, and as the old Irish proverb is, life's tragic, but it ain't. Life's tragic, but it ain't serious, And Pat has that Irish in him, and he just rolls. He rolls, and of course, part of that is the pain that comes out. So, but he tells so many funny stories about his father, and many people who read the great Santini thought his father was killed in war. It's not true. Pat wound up having to live with him and take care of him. In The Death of Santini is another book, and because Pat's mother left him, and he tells about when, was it Robert Duvall played Santini? I think it was. So his dad took an ego trip. Of course, he denied the abuse and everything, and he would sit out front and sign books and say, thank you for reading my son's work of fiction. And what Pat did, he said, well, son, who's going to play me? John Wayne? Or are you going to get to play me? And he said, well, Dad, we're working on it. So he had the producer send him a letter to his dad and said, dear Mr. Conroy, after careful consideration, we have decided to cast you with, we're going to have Truman Capote play you. And those were some of the fun games that went on. Of course, I got to know the family after that. I've been down to South Carolina a lot. I've had his brother, Tim, on a good bit. Cassandra King, some of you have read her work. She was his third wife, and she was married to him for 17 years. And through this show, I share this. These are some of the stories. Henry Sweets, I mentioned it. Rick Bragg. Any of you read Rick Bragg, some of his work? Rick is such a character, and he had his book out on Jerry Lee Lewis. How many of you remember Jerry Lee Lewis? Great Balls of Fire. Now, I know some of you don't, but there's Jerry Lee Lewis in our day, Elvis and Jerry Lee and that crowd, Sun Records out of Memphis. And so Rick lived with Jerry Lee I think Jerry Lee's still alive, but Rick lived with him for several summers, and Rick is really funny. And Rick tells the story. I always resented Jerry Lee because I thought that Rick tried to kill Elvis. Jerry Lee tried to kill Elvis. You remember that story went around, and that Jerry Lee went out to Graceland and he ran through the gates and so on. Well, Rick explained that that wasn't true. That's not how it happened. Jerry Lee was in a bar drinking, and he was carrying his pistol, which he always carried, and he had that big limo that he drove. And so Elvis called Jerry Lee. I want y'all to know this. You take this to your grave, because Jerry Lee did not try to kill Elvis. And Jerry Lee says, I'm going out there, and they said, well, you better put that gun in your dad, that pistol in the desk, because you get stopped. So anyway, he did that. He was going out to Graceland to, counsel Elvis, I assume, or play the piano. And he ran off the road, and the police stopped him. No, the police stopped him. And Jerry Lee was drinking, but he's Jerry Lee Lewis, and the police knew him. And they said, sir, you'll have to get out of the car. Nowadays, you get killed. But he said, I'm not getting out of this car. And they said, well, why, Jerry? He said, I'll get out of this car when I finish listening to this song on the radio. Now, you think you could get by with that? I don't think so. Anyway, they got him back on the road. He went out to the gates of Graceland, and he is drinking, and he didn't stop, and he went too fast, and he kind of nudged the gates. Well, Elvis's cousin was there, and he was the guard. You know how relatives always employ their other relatives. And so his cousin was the guard, and the guard called Elvis and said, Jerry Lee's here, but he's drunk. And Elvis said, call the police, which they did. And Jerry Lee never forgave him. But the story went around for a long time, as some of you may know, of they tried to kill Elvis. And then lastly, there's so many stories, but the peach lady, there was a lady who wrote a book on peach recipes. And so I picked up the paper there in Winston-Salem, and she was going to be over to the Mayberry restaurant. And I'm thinking, I had an interviewer. I need an interview, but I've never had one other person on with cookbooks. And so I'm like, I don't think this is going to be much, but so I go, and this lady's there. She has a book on peaches, a very beautiful illustrator. I'm sorry, I can't think of the name right now. And so I say, after she finishes, I said, I'd like to interview you, and I'm with WEHC 90.7 Poets and Writers. And she said, well, okay, sure. And so we go sit in my car. It's about 100 degrees. It's in July, and that's my studio. And I noticed that she was very self-contained and assertive in what she was doing. And she said, get these windows rolled down. Went on the left, the right, so on, and she's giving me directions. So as I started interviewing her, I said, well, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from. And she said, well, I grew up in Chicago, but my grandmother was a sharecropper down in Mississippi or so on. And she said, and I was also the first black airline stewardess, first African-American back in your day, and so on. And then she said, and I said, well, tell us some more about yourself. She said, also, I'm a licensed commercial pilot. Isn't that fascinating? You go from a peach lady who's giving peach recipes to a certified licensed commercial pilot. And she'd done all these other things. And anyway, it turned out to be a fascinating interview. I'm watching the clock here, and I want to move to poetry now because that's what we're talking about a good bit on Poets and Writers. And as I say, we like to write, we like to have you. If you want to send me a poem, I'll read it on air at some point. Right now, we're pretty booked up, but it's McCarthy Henry at yahoo.com. And as we like to say, we write poems in our hearts every day, but we're often afraid to share it. So send me a few lines to McCarthy Henry, and we'll put them on. I didn't mention Jack Kerouac, but I tell you, I didn't get his best buddy owns a Flamingo bar in St. Petersburg, Florida. I have to tell this story because I go up there, I meet this young waiter, and I mentioned Kerouac. I said, I've been by his house. He said, well, if you go up there to Flamingo bar, Ray Nichols knows everything about it because he used to run around with him. So I get Patty to go with me. And we go in this bar, and it's a throwback to the 40s. I mean, they're clanking glasses, they're shooting pool, and these guys are like, and Patty says, I don't know about this, and the flu was going around. And she said, the lady serving us a beer, and Patty said something. She said, yeah, I've had the flu for 2 or 3 days. So anyway, I said, well, I'd like to get to Ray Nichols. I understand. She said, he's not in here right now, but said, if you call him back in a few days. So I said, well, I'm leaving town. I still have his card in my pocket. And I called him by phone to book him, right? And doing phone interviews, that's why I would much rather use my little recorder, because the phone interviews get to be really touchy. I got him on. We had a student intern. He wasn't there. So I had a great discussion. You could hear all the background. He said, yeah, I knew Jack. He said, you know, we used to do drugs together and everything. He said, and I tell you what, that boy over, he's still alive. The fellow over at Florida State played football. He used to run around with him. You can call him. So he's got all these letters and everything. So I told a friend of mine about that at Appalachian State, and he said, that's a gold mine. Okay. Poetry from the heart. I share this and I make no claims. I'm just who I am, and I share my thoughts. And I think poetry is talking on paper. But this is one I put together the other morning. As I said, Patty's now in 10th day of knee replacement. And one of the things I've done with grandkids is giving gifts. You give bird feeders, you know, because they get all this other junk. So I gave each of our families, we have 3 families, 7 grandkids, I gave them a bird feeder this year because I'm always playing with a bird feeder. This morning, the day after Patty's surgery, fixing breakfast, the birds come. Bluebirds, sparrows, cardinals, and the downy woodpeckers. They come in pairs, always in pairs, to feed. The need for mates to get us through the mornings, pairs of love, pairs of commitment, to get us through the mornings. The need for mates. And it's interesting, I sent that to I have a great network of poets, and some are very well known, but I got a feedback from a lady in Winston-Salem I've known for a long time, not really into poetry, but she said, I really love that poem. So it reminded me of mine and my husband's relationship, so I appreciated that. Library poems. I want to mention some library poems I mentioned to you early on that I've been, and I just played a little bit of Elaine Westbrook. Here's a book I'll share with you about libraries. The library book, some of you may be familiar with it, by Susan Orlean. It's the story of the fire in California. So many of you, I was not aware of it. And to give Patty a great deal of credit, we're headed to Chapel Hill, and she says, what questions are you going to ask her? I said, you know, I just make them up as I go. And she said, well, I just heard on NPR that the library book is really good to read, Susan Orlean. So I brought this book up to the library at Elaine Westbrook. She said, oh, yes, said all her staff, everyone. So that's really a great book. And it's, if you love libraries, I bet if I went around right now and said, do you remember the first library you were in? If you thought for a moment, first time you went to the library, or second, where it was, mine was Maine Williams down in Johnson City. I used to walk down Lincoln Street to get there. And so many of us grew up in libraries, and libraries are a community. Make no mistake, they are a community, and you go into urban areas today, and you know as well as I do, they are communities. There may be a fellow sitting over there with the trash can over his head or a waste basket, but they are in there for many different reasons, technology, and they will line up in the early morning. So this is actually the story of the fire that took place and burned many of the books in the Los Angeles Library, and also the story of the fellow who liked to tell stories and went around saying that he started it and told so many stories that they called him and investigated him, but they didn't convict him. So this is called, and I'm going to read a couple of poems quickly about libraries, which is usually I read more street poetry, but this, the writer says, I went to the library late one day just before closing time, when the light outside was already dusky and the place was sleepy and slow. Central Library and the Bradley Wing are so big that when the crowds thin out, the library can feel very private, almost like a secret place. and the space is so enveloping that you have no sense of the world outside. As she skips on down here, I'll skip on down. A library is a good place to soften solitude, a place where you feel part of a conversation that has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Even when you're all alone, the library is a whispering past. You don't need to take your book off a shelf to know there is a voice inside that is waiting to speak to you. And behind that was someone who truly believed that if he or she spoke, someone would listen. It was that affirmation that amazed me. Even the oddest, most particular book was written with that kind of crazy courage, the writer's belief that someone would find his or her book important to read. And I'll very quickly read a few of them. Over the years, I have written, just jotted these down, and I, for some reason, happened to think of that today, and I'll finish with a couple of these library poems. 45. What I'm doing right now is dead again on radio because that's dead air. Wake Forest Library. It is a cold, blue February day. Through the downstairs window, I observe you, backpack, cell phone, North Face jacket, bend and pick up a dead leaf, twirl it between your fingers, then disappear across campus. I love college students. I love working with them. I love observing them. This is about the Emory and Henry Library. There exists an old green gold-lettered book stuck deep in the shelves of the Emory and Henry Library. In the back of the book, the signature card records the names of only 2 young men who touched this book long ago. Before war, work, and women called to them, come and experience the future. Leave the old book on the dusty shelf behind the new computers that glow and Google all the information one needs. That's a little tongue-in-cheek. And then I have one, and I guess I'll read it because a fella came up to me at Zazzy's one day and said, I bought your book, and said, I really like it. I said, what's your favorite poem? And it's so funny. What you like about this book? And he said, I like Email Love. He said, that reminds me of Billy Cobham's. I said, I told my wife you're as good as Billy Cobham's. Well, that was quite a compliment, you know. Email Love. Today, the Friday before Easter, sitting in front of the computer in the Wake Forest Library, reading an email from Russia. Her name is Natasha, and she tells me she is pretty and friendly, sends me love and sweet kisses. Over my shoulder, near the front desk, the well-formed librarian counsels 2 college boys. Now, if a girl touches you softly on the shoulder, it means she really likes you, and if she looks you in the eye, then you're making real progress. Quickly, I return to my email, reading of the big sweet kisses Natasha desires to give me when I send her the money. All right, a little bit about libraries. This is another book I wrote. I'm going to share that with you, Dave. I get so amused. You know, this interpretive literature that college professors did. You know, I took a course in poetry in college on Robert Frost, and I was a good student, but the professor gave me a B because I didn't see the Freudian symbolism in it. You know, now I love sex, I love erotica, but I just saw, and I picked this up because evidently I had run this off for another reason, so I put my notes on the front, but on the back, it's an analysis of birches. You know, birches swinging in a tree and climbing, and the boys bark from baseball, and he's out there and he's springing those trees down. They said, erotica. It's so erotic. Which I'm not, and then they took it and started telling about, you know, the limp trees and bending them down, and girls, you know, with their hair down and crawling around on the ground. So they saw a lot of erotica. I just saw a lonely kid out there swinging trees down, trying to, who missed baseball. But Robert Frost, and by the way, one time, I think it's been a while since I spoke here, somebody came up and said, well, you don't like Robert. I love Robert Frost. I'm not Robert Frost. I'm not trying to be Robert Frost. I'm just trying to be me. And I'm going to close with this last one of Emily Dickinson. If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life, the aching, if I can ease one life the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin into his nest again, or help one fainting robin into his nest again, I shall not live in vain. I'm going to read this again. If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin into his nest again, I shall not live in vain. Thank you. That's from a great poet. Thank you.